So a little reluctant to step back into the great Season 8 debate, but Peter Dinklage has spoken recently to the New York Times. Let me just clarify. He did speak out on Season 8 before. This isn't the first time, but this is much more lengthy. And essentially, a lot of people saying he's blaming the fans. Well, it seems what he's saying is that the reason for the fan backlash, and I don't agree, is that most of the fans had this expectation to give the white characters, those are his words, a happy ending. They didn't get that. Hence, there was a lot of anger, and they didn't understand how good the scripts were, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot of things to be said. He's making several different points. One of them I will half agree with, one of them he's completely wrong, and one of them makes no sense. One of the points he makes is, well, it's a fictional story, it's about dragons, really move on. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I make this point a lot. We don't have, quote, objective reality with fiction. But, and this I felt with Kit Harington, if you think the story is so childish, why did you accept all those Emmys? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. If you think, well, it's just a piece of fiction. Yeah, why are you getting rewarded for this piece of fiction then? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So a little bit of hypocrisy there. But in terms of the fan backlash and that it's driven by some hatred, there is half a point to be made. Now, looking at most of the people who are critical of Season 8, people like Quinn, myself, Dragon Demands, I don't think we were driven necessarily by hatred, but you do have other people like Gary at Nerdrotic, Geeks and Gamers, Mauler, so on and so forth. They've often taken political stances and said things, I think, again, irrelevant, that does label them as properly haters, and they often put out hate propaganda with its homophobia, sexism, racism, whatever, and these are being added to the debate and they're not really relevant. As much as I don't like where Gary is going with his current work, that really doesn't diminish the value of the criticisms. Even though I have issues with the Mauler videos, they're not as strong as they should be on Game of Thrones, he does raise a lot of legitimate points. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag that you do have, unfortunately, some people who have jumped on the bandwagon and they have very mixed politics. But nevertheless, as long as they do good research and they make some legitimate points, I see no problem here. But yes, he is partly correct that some people with hateful views have joined the conversation. So he makes half a point. But in terms of his basic point that they were upset because they didn't get a happy ending, I can only speak for myself. That's not the reason I didn't like Season 8. I give it a very brutal 3 or 3.5 out of 10, and that seems to mirror the audience very well. I just didn't like the way the storytelling was done. I really wasn't focused or obsessed about Dany and Jon or even Brienne and Jaime. I didn't really care about the major characters anyway. I myself cared more about the minor characters, but the minor characters weren't well done either. So all around, I was very disappointed. And given the budget they had, given the time they had, remember they had 2 years, I think there was a proper amount of hatred and disgust, especially if you do more and more research in terms of the behind-the-scenes shenanigans that Benioff and Weiss did. And again, being well paid and often not earning the money that they got, it, I think, led to a lot of correct frustration at what was going on and why it was going on. So I disagree. I don't think most of the fan backlash was unjustified. I think most of it was justified. But there were, yes, in some cases, people who were bringing kind of extraneous issues into it, whether they were obsessed over Dany and Jon, or whether they were kind of these alt-right people trying to bring in a political thing that was not really there in terms of the storytelling. I agree that's problematic, but I don't think that's the majority of the fandom. I think the majority of the fandom was pretty flexible in terms of what the ending would be, but the ending, the way it was done, was very rushed, it was very silly, it was absurd, it contradicted the lore within the show itself. So while I do agree that Peter Dinklage is a really great actor, and he did a really great performance, I don't think he did a great Tyrion, especially if you follow the books. In the books, Tyrion is much more ruthless, he's much more pragmatic, he's much more evil. But they decided to make Tyrion a very likable, kind of roguish character. You always had some sympathy for him. And I think in the early seasons, he really gave great performances. But I gotta be honest, after season 5, the show declined, the scripts declined, And he still was a good performer, but it didn't make sense. He just took so many stupid pills. It was insane. He just stopped being a very interesting, clever character and just became this kind of robot for the plot. And I respect his opinion as a performer. He's actually from the East Coast, and so am I. And he's an inspiration going from independent auteur films and making a lot of money through Game of Thrones. So I understand he's biased and he owes Benioff and Weiss. And I understand he probably does beat a lot of fans who are very simplistic or can't capture the complexity of the story. That may all well be true, but there are fans who were very careful. They did do a lot of research, and they found a lot of errors and mistakes with season 8. In some cases, yes, they brought in irrelevant politics or partisanship, but I think the majority of people who were critics did so from an angle of wanting a great story to a great show that they were dedicated to, but one that heavily disappointed them. But I can understand his point of view, being very defensive of Benioff and Weiss and trying to, and then seeing, yes, a lot of these creators, whether Gary or Jeremy of Geeks and Gamers, putting out a lot of hate videos, he's then generalizing to the other critics. I understand all that. That's very understandable. But it's just not true. I think if you look at the majority of the fandom, the majority of the critics, they really did just hate the quality of storytelling and its decline. And yes, we may have somewhat of an agenda too, but it's not the one he describes. At least not from the people I know and respect and who really do try to give the show and the performers an honest chance to do the material, which unfortunately I think they did a disservice to. Whether that was intentional or not, we're still debating. But this idea that we misjudge D&D, I don't think so. I think we're actually still being fairly generous in asking for a fuller explanation with what happened with season 8. Thanks for listening.